The Emancipation Proclamation affected many by its strong stance on slavery. While lauded as an amazing document by some, critics hated it for not going far enough, or because it seemed like the president was overstepping his boundaries. Despite all the negative feedback that has been generated by this presidential proclamation, this document was a key step toward getting rid of the immoral slave traditions. So what was the context behind the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, to begin with, you have the South versus the North. Differences between these regions were very large. In the North, slavery died out as industrialization took over. In fact, laborers in factories, both immigrants and Americans, phased the slaves out of existence. However, the South was on the opposite side of the spectrum. It was a region heavily dependent on slavery, as agriculture, a business that ran better with slaves, was very profitable at the time. The white population barely outnumbered the black population in the South. The need to industrialize was never a strong goal felt for many southern states at that time. As these two different regions clashed, many issues and grievances started to develop. One main problem that eventually brought the Civil War and subsequent Emancipation Proclamation to a head was the delicate balance of free and slave states. One extra state on either side would greatly help in each one's argument for or against slavery. Succession was bandied about by southern states if the North were to add one extra free state. It was into this disaster waiting to happen that men tried to pull the states back together. They attempted many compromises in order to appease both sides. Although there are many events to look at, I picked a select few that seem most relevant to the emancipation. To start with, we have the Wilmot Proviso, an amendment to a presidential bill in 1846. In this proposal, David Wilmot said the U.S. should prohibit slavery in any territory that came from the conquered Mexican territory. The North heartily agreed, but the South became outraged. This blatantly upset the balance of free and slave states. In opposition to Wilmot, the Calhoun resolutions were put into effect. John C. Calhoun, a Southern senator, outlined Southern state views and said that territories were not states, so they could not stop or start slavery. He and many other Southerners believed that Congress could not legislate slavery. Only states could choose whether they wanted slavery or not. As people attempted to compromise, the idea of popular sovereignty was born. Many combined Wilmot's and Calhoun's writings into one idea that said if the majority of voters wanted slavery, then they can have it, and vice versa. Coming off of these three different opinions, the Compromise of 1850 was introduced by Henry Clay. It tried to keep the peace between both the North and the South by allowing California to be a free state, abolishing slave trade in the District of Columbia, yet protecting slavery in Columbia, and it required the Fugitive Slave Act. This Fugitive Slave Act was the most controversial part of the compromise, and actually hurt the compromise in the long run. This new and more efficient act required escaped slaves to be returned to their masters. Northerners reacted negatively against it, and abolitionists started to attack the general South, not just slaveholders. This attack made Southerners, both slave masters and regular citizens, promote slavery as good. Another key governmental decision made by the Emancipation before the Emancipation Proclamation was put into effect was the Dred Scott case. Roger B. Taney, Chief Justice, said that a slave did not have the ability to sue, as he was not a citizen. Taney stated that black men had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This act made slavery theoretically possible in all territories and made the popular sovereignty idea unclear. Taney also ruled the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. This decision played a key part in forcing Lincoln into the political spotlight. You then have Harper's Ferry, which showed the huge amount of tension between the North and the South. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, raided the ferry in hopes to start a slave revolution. He was stopped, but come to find out had strong Republican ties. Interestingly enough, Lincoln's opinion of the matter was that John agreed with us in thinking slavery wrong, but that cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. As all these events converged, the heated election of 1860 comes up. Abraham defeated the four opponents running in the race, but his victory was short-lived as several southern states, not liking Lincoln's stand on slavery, seceded from the Union. On April 12, 1861, the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, and one of the bloodiest wars of American history began. 11 states now had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. Although the South was outgunned and outmanned, their superior generals made it a tough war for the Union to win. The main goal of the South during the war was to last long enough to get Britain to support them, as France had helped the U.S. in the Revolutionary War. This support would have greatly increased the chance of defeating the Union. However, the British would not support the Confederacy unless they were clearly winning the war. That's why many Southerners pushed for one decisive win against the North. The North, on the other hand, had the tough task of defeating the South by offensive pushes. Of the two, the North had the hardest goal, as they were fighting men who were defending their homes and lifestyle. The course of the war was long and hard. Both sides saw the need for action in order to keep their troops and supporters hopeful. Lincoln wanted to release his emancipation as a war measure to bolster morale, but his advisors told him to wait for a Union victory, or else it would look like Lincoln was scrambling for support. An important battle that set the stage for the Emancipation Proclamation was the Battle of Antietam. While it was technically a stalemate, the Union claimed victory, allowing Lincoln to release his proclamation. As you can see, America was in utter turmoil during this time. There were different sides all clamoring for what they believed to be right. But where did Lincoln stand on ideas like slavery, succession, equality, and the war? For one, Lincoln states in his first inaugural address that secession is against the Constitution and thereby impossible. He was ready and willing to enforce all laws across all the states. In regards to slavery, Abraham believed that there was an obvious moral difference between the phrase, "all men are created equal," and the way slavery was instituted throughout the U.S. Before he was president, Lincoln wanted slavery totally abolished, but he thought that was an impossible goal. He believed that the federal government should not influence the slavery already established in states, and he heartily held to the Free Soil Doctrine, which wanted the federal government to utterly halt the spread of slavery. Lincoln supposed that if slavery was stopped from spreading, it would soon die out. But as the war progressed, one can see a change in Lincoln's thinking. He saw the chance to end slavery in the United States with his newfound presidential power and decided that total abolishment would be the best for the Union. His views of equality between the blacks and whites were very vague. As a politician, his words were shadowy and indecisive so that he could reach the biggest audience. He maneuvered around just about any equality question put to him, although he said in his speech at Ottawa in regards to the black men that, "in the right to eat bread without the leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man." Rather than directly confront the issue about the equality of blacks to whites, Abraham pushed it off and said in his 7th speech with Douglas, "The real issue in this controversy, the one pressing upon every mind, is the sentiment on the part of one class that looks upon slavery as wrong, and of the other class that does not look upon it as wrong." What were Lincoln's thoughts about the war? He definitely opposed slavery, but his main reason for war against the South was his stance on the Union. In Lincoln's letter to Horace Greeley, he states that my paramount object is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So what were some of Abraham Lincoln's reasons for writing the Emancipation Proclamation? For one, Britain had a strong anti-slavery attitude at the time, so by releasing the document when he did, he was attempting to keep the European superpower from helping the South. Lincoln also wanted black people to join the Northern Army, and getting black men to fight for his army, he hoped that some of the radical abolitionists would be appeased. Lincoln also hoped to revive Northern morale by giving his troops and supporters another reason to fight other than that of preserving the Union. He also used the proclamation as a stepping stone to free the slaves. But above all, Lincoln wanted to obtain a united America at all costs. I'll read this excerpt from the Emancipation Proclamation so you get a full picture of what Lincoln was attempting to say. Interestingly enough, the proclamation reads more like a legal document rather than a momentous speech. Now, therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, in accordance with my purpose, so to do publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Plaquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James Extension, Assumption, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by virtue of the power, and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that, in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. Upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. So what did the Emancipation do after it was made? For one, The Confederacy was never recognized as a legitimate country by Britain. Many blacks joined the Union forces. The idea that former slaves could fight their masters in order to save more of their fellow race was really popular, and thousands of blacks just flocked to the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation preserved the Union. The idea of slavery was of little consequence to Lincoln. He was much more worried about the preservation of the Union. His emancipation easily preserved and strengthened the Union. Probably the most important effect of the Emancipation Proclamation was the change in ideals. The Northerners, whether on purpose or not, were motivated by the idea that they were fighting for freedom. The Emancipation changed the foundational way Northerners saw the war. They were fighting for freedom rather than fighting for the preservation of the Union. This attitude greatly increased morale and made it look like the North was striving for what the revolutionaries had when fighting against Britain. But, according to Barry Schwartz's article, The Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's Many Second Thoughts, Lincoln thought of his document as an emergency war declaration that would be decimated by the Supreme Court. He seemed to believe it would be a temporary war measure used only to hold the Union together. In many documents after the proclamation, the president seemed ready and willing to preserve slavery if that meant the South's surrender. What did the proclamation not do? Ironically, at the time of the release, the proclamation did not free any slaves. It applied only to states that seceded from the Union. The proclamation was not effective in the border states, as Lincoln did not want to lose their support. Nor did it free the slaves in the states that the Union had conquered. In effect, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves, as the Confederacy considered itself out of the jurisdiction of Lincoln's law. But as the Union advanced through the South, many slaves were freed. The Emancipation Proclamation was no whimsical delusion of a nonchalant president, but rather a smart, diplomatic statement against slavery. It was the first successive measure taken to stop slavery in all of U.S. history. The Emancipation Proclamation showed a change in Abraham Lincoln's thinking. He used to, and still did to an extent, heavily rely on past institutions and ideas. He was constantly referring to the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution to support his arguments, but now he was ready and willing to tackle the future. His proclamation did not look back on the past, but forged audaciously ahead. It was progressive and bold compared to what many of his prior acts had been. Despite this document's limitations, it became a vital part of destroying slavery.